So she's an expert really in nutrition. And this meeting is being recorded. And she's really has over many years now investigated how nutrition is important for our aging and potentially for prevention of age-related diseases like dementia. So it's great to have her here. Just a few housekeeping issues. As always, if you could please keep your microphone switched off during the talk, and please keep your video switched off during the talk, just so that we can listen to Anne Marie. If you have any questions or answers, you can click on the chat bar which is in your meeting control toolbar. This will open a chat area on the right of your screen, and you can put your comments, questions, or suggestions to everyone while basically Anne Marie is talking, or you can do it at the end when we have a Q&A time, but you can type them anytime you want to. We will go through them at the end of the session. If you want to ask a question in person, switch on your video, but keep your microphone off, and we will ask you to switch on your microphone to ask your question. But if your question was not answered or you want more information, you can also always email us, and we can forward your email then to Anne Marie if there's a specific question for her. We will put the email address at the end again into the chat, so you will have it in case you want to contact us. But without further ado now, I'm going to hand over to Anne Marie, and she's talking to us about nutrition and brain vitality. We are what we eat. So I stop sharing. And Anne Marie, if you're happy to share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I hope my internet holds out. It's struggling a bit at the moment, but we'll carry on. So everyone, yeah, this is my topic for today. And I'll just kind of start off with the bad news. We always start off with that dementia affects 1 in 14 over 65 and 1 in 6 over the age of 80. And of course, it's very much an age-related condition, and there tends to be about twice as many dementia patients who are female relative to male. So that's kind of the bad news out of the way. The good news is no matter where you are on the dementia trajectory, there's always things that can be done to affect your cognitive ability and cognitive performance. And the other bit of good news is that age standardized dementia rates are coming down all of the time in the UK. So this figure here gives the number of cases of dementia in 2019 and what they're predicted to be in 2050. And as you can see, there's a sharp increase in the number of people who are predicted to be suffering from dementia, from around 907,000 to 1.6 million or so. But of course, that's really a function of the fact that we're aging quite successfully in this country, and it's very much an age-related condition. But the very good news is that age standardized rates are coming down. So for example, the number of people who are 75 suffering from dementia, the number of people who are 80 suffering from dementia and so forth is coming down all of the time. The other good news, I suppose, we always think of how many dementia cases there are, but if you look at it the other way around, 1 in 14 over the age of 65 have dementia, but that means 13 and 14 don't have dementia. And 1 in 6 over the age of 80 have dementia. It means 5 and 6 don't have dementia. And I guess what I'm going to talk about today is kind of how you can keep yourself dementia free through dietary strategies. But a lot of what I'm speaking today is also relevant for dementia patients. So even people with existing dementia, some of the dietary approaches I will speak to are just as relevant. And of course, not just to talk about dementia prevention, but cognition or cognitive decline to a degree is a part of normal aging. So we're really interested also, we'll talk about, what nutrition strategies optimize cognition into all of these. And cognition is defined as the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experiences, and the senses. And it includes such domains as attention, memory, problem solving, decision making, planning, inhibition, and so forth. And what is the evidence that dietary strategies can promote good health? And this is a study or a paper from colleagues from Harvard School of Public Health. The analysis was led by Walter Willett and Frank Hu. And it was from the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Study. And what they did is they took 123,000 people, followed up for a very long period of time, 34 years, and they scored everybody at baseline on 5 criteria: whether or not folks smoked, whether or not folks were physically active, alcohol consumption, diet quality, and whether or not people had a normal BMI. So the maximum score you could get is 5, and obviously the minimum score is 0. And what this study showed really impressively was that at age 50, people who scored 5 versus who scored 0 can expect to live 14 years longer if you're female and 12 years longer if you're male, really showing the impact of lifestyle behaviours on life expectancy. So that's life expectancy overall. What about Alzheimer's risk and Alzheimer's cases? And this was a study which was led by Martha Claire Morris from Rush University in Chicago. And she did a similar kind of exercise. She scored people on the basis of 5 criteria, slightly different in that the 5th criteria was whether or not people engaged in late life cognitive activities. And what this analysis showed was that people who scored 4 to 5 versus 0 to 1 had a 60% reduction in their dementia risk. Really impressive indeed. And even more encouraging, I think, was even increasing your score by 1 reduced your dementia risk by 27% with a hazard ratio of 0.73. So today we'll focus specifically on diet quality and dementia risk or cognition. And what kind of things are important? So I've highlighted some of these on this slide, and we'll talk a little bit about what dietary patterns are important. We'll refer to the importance of oily fish and also what types of fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables overall are important, but I'll give a little bit of guidance as to perhaps which we should focus on more than others. And also I've spent a long time, longer than I care to remember, working on omega-3 fatty acids. So I'll give a little bit of the evidence on how much omega-3 fatty acids and how we source these from the diet. Up here in the right-hand corner is an often forgotten factor, which is hydration. We should be consuming as adults about 1.5 litres of fluid a day, and that can include tea and coffee, water, low sugar squash, things like that. Oftentimes, and particularly as we age, we tend to consume less fluids. And one of the greatest source of loss of cognition or confusion over the course of the day is dehydration. So I think a really simple way to improve our cognition is often to stay hydrated. So the first thing I will talk about is a Mediterranean diet or a Mediterranean style plant-based diet, a healthy UK diet as well, I would say. There's very much overlap between the two. And what is a plant-based Mediterranean style diet? It tends to be focused on whole plant-based foods, things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, things like beans, nuts, and lentils, and seeds. So a Mediterranean diet is very rich in these whole plant foods. Also, it promotes the consumption of fish, perhaps 3 times a week or more. And it really suggests that we minimize our meat and particularly our processed meat intake to maybe less than once or twice a week. And we also minimize the intake of things like what we call discretionary foods, things like the things we like to eat actually, things like pastries, sweets, cakes, ice cream, sausage rolls, all of those kinds of things, probably once or less a week. So, and if you consume alcohol as part of your daily routine, a Mediterranean diet suggests that it should be of the red wine variety and in moderation. And we've used the scoring system as part of our research here, which gives 14 criteria which demonstrate adherence to a Mediterranean diet. And you can read these for yourself. So they suggest you get a point if you use olive oil as your main culinary fat, and if you consume more than 4 tablespoons a day. It's recommended you have 2 or more portions of vegetables a day, 3 or more portions of fruit. Eat red meat or processed meat once or less per week. Limit our consumption of things like butter, margarine, and cream. Also limit our consumption of carbonated sweet drinks, sugar-sweetened beverages. Also have a moderate consumption of red wine. Have 3 or more portions of legumes per week. Consume 3 or more portions of fish per week. Limit our intake, as I said earlier, of things like commercial sweets and pastries. Great food that we should all be consuming is consume nuts 3 or more times a week. Eat more poultry compared to red meat. And also use in our cooking sauces based on things like tomatoes, onions, leeks, or garlic. Now you can all check for yourself how adherent you are, but if you follow all of those 14 criteria, you will score a perfect 14 score on this MEDAS scoring criteria, which we often use in our research, and I'll come back to again. What is the evidence that a Mediterranean diet is beneficial to health? And this is what's called a meta-analysis, which I'll present to you now, which combines data from lots of different studies. And this actually combined data from 70 different studies. And it looked at various disease outcomes. It looked at type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancers, and cognition. And we'll focus here on cognition. And what it showed, this meta-analysis, that if you had high adherence to a Mediterranean style diet versus low adherence, it reduced your risk of mild cognitive impairment by about 31%, and it reduced your risk of Alzheimer's disease by about 40%. And I will enforce here again, and I'll say it throughout my talk, that what I'm saying here is also relevant to the progression of cognitive decline in people with pre-existing dementia. And when we look at a particular publication which we use widely in the field of dementia, which was the Lancet Commission report, the first report was published in 2017. There's since been an update in 2020, led by Jill Livingston and team. The only dietary pattern that specifically was mentioned in this Lancet report, for which there's significant and conclusive evidence for benefits with respect to dementia, is adherence to a Mediterranean diet. Now, lots of the evidence so far has been evidence which has been conducted in one of the 21 countries which make up the Mediterranean basin. What is the evidence that a Mediterranean diet, if adopted in a UK population, has the same cognitive benefits? And myself and Michael and others in Norwich have been involved in a program of research called MEDEX over the last 5 years. And this was one of the first papers we published to look at that very question, the benefits of a Mediterranean diet on cognitive health in a UK population. And what we did is we took participants in the EPIC Norfolk study. Now, some of you may be participants yourself or might know somebody who participates in this study. It's a study that's been ongoing since the early 1990s, and people have been followed up ever since. And for this particular analysis, we took data from about 8,000 participants in EPIC Norfolk who'd been followed up for 15 years. And it looked at whether people had been adherent to a Mediterranean diet or not, and then what was their cognitive function 15 years later. And what this analysis clearly showed us was that people who were adherent to a Mediterranean diet had better global cognition, better verbal episodic memory, and also better prospective memory. So clear benefits with respect to memory. And the really interesting thing was if people increased their MEDAS score, their Mediterranean diet score, by only 1 on the 14-point scale, it was the equivalent to about 1 year of aging, which was a really strong effect size. And this is follow-up analysis we've done on the UK Biobank, which we've just submitted for publication. And this was done in a larger number of participants, in 60,000 participants. And actually, in this particular analysis, we were looking at dementia incidence rather than cognition. And again, I'll just refer your attention to this top set of bars here, where we took this 14-point MEDA scale, which I've just gone through. And again, it's shown in this UK-wide cohort, the UK Biobank cohort, that a high versus a low adherence to a Mediterranean diet was associated with about a 23% reduced risk of dementia. And I won't spend too long on this, but this is kind of an additional set of confirmation of the Mediterranean diet, where they've looked at things like brain volumes, they've looked at things like amyloid deposition by PET scan, they've looked at glucose metabolism by brain scan, and they've also looked at biomarkers of neurophysiological damage in the cerebrospinal fluid. And regardless of the outcome measure of interest, there is strong evidence that a Mediterranean diet has a positive impact on all of these markers of brain health. So that's kind of evidence where you look at associations and populations. Has there been any intervention studies done which have shown the benefits of a Mediterranean diet on brain health? And they've been relatively limited, and I'll go on to talk about one we've done in Norwich in a second. But one of the first that's been done in the area was a study conducted in Spain. It was a very large study called the PREDIMED study. And the main purpose of this study was to look at the benefits on cardiovascular health. And it involved 7,500 people in 11 different centers in Spain. And they had 3 diets, and people were on the diets for 5 years. They had a controlled diet, a Mediterranean diet which was enriched in extra virgin olive oil. That's a bit of a mouthful. Or they had a third diet, which was a Mediterranean diet, which was enriched with nuts. And they showed great benefits on cardiovascular health, but 2 of the 11 centers also looked at brain health. One of these centers was the Barcelona Center, which involved 500 people. And they did show, and it was a 5-year intervention, and over 5 years, they did indeed show an effect of a Mediterranean diet on global cognition, and in particular on verbal learning, the Ravel's test, and also on the color trail test, which assesses things like attention and executive function, which is our ability to conduct daily tasks and make decisions. And also in the Navarra Center, which also involved about 500 people, and they used 2 measures of brain health in this particular study. They used the MMSE, the Many Mental State Examination, which some of you may be familiar with, and also the clock drawing test, which again are global measures of cognitive performance. And again showed very nicely that the Mediterranean diet groups, in particular the Mediterranean diet groups that had extra virgin olive oil, there was clear evidence of cognitive benefits in this particular intervention study. What about the evidence of intervention studies in the UK? And we're currently collaborators in 2 of these studies. One of these studies is ongoing. It's been run out of University College London with about 700 participants, and it's a 2-year intervention. And a Mediterranean diet, plant-based Mediterranean diet, is very much part of the intervention strategy for that particular cohort. But what I'll talk about today is a study that we've just finished called the MEDEX study, which we ran here out of Norwich, and Michael and myself and many others, as you'll see listed here, have been involved in running. And this was sponsored by AR UK and also by the MRC, the Medical Research Council. In this particular study, it was kind of a feasibility study to see how effectively we could intervene with a Mediterranean diet in the UK population, because it's never really been done before or tested properly. So what we did is we had 108 participants between 3 centres, Norwich, Newcastle and Birmingham. We recruited people at slightly above average risk of heart disease. They had a QS2 score greater than 10%. And their MEDAS score was less than 9 on the 14-point scale, and participants were also didn't meet the current guidelines, which is 150 minutes of moderate or high intensity physical activity per week. And down here you can see the baseline characteristics of the participants. So the average age was about 67 years, and about 3/4 of our participants were females. We had 3 groups: a control group, a Mediterranean diet group, and a Mediterranean diet plus physical activity group. And our intervention had 4 different components. So what we aimed to do over 6 months was to increase people's Mediterranean diet adherence score, quality of people's Mediterranean diet, by 3 on a 14-point scale. And we also tried to get people's physical activity up to higher than 150 minutes, moderate to high intensity per week. And in order to support people to change their behavior, we had 4 different strategies. We gave people individual goals, so people could choose which elements of the MEDAS scale they wanted to increase. We had group sessions. We also provided people with food delivery, and we also had an online platform called Leap2, which people could refer to for information and support. And we were very pleased indeed with the outcome. So this shows at baseline in our 3 groups what people's MEDAS score was. So it was about on average 6 to 7 on the 14-point scale, the quality of people's diet. And by 6 months or 24 weeks, we had managed to increase people's score, or people had managed to increase their own score by an average of 3 to 4 points, which was a very pleasing outcome. Now, we included cognition. We didn't expect cognition to change in 6 months because that's a very short time scale in this relatively small scale study with 108 people. We didn't expect to see a significant effect on cognition over 6 months. But actually, much to our surprise, we did see a very nice effect of cognition, even after 24 weeks on the diet. And you can see that the greatest effect was seen in the combined group, which was the Mediterranean diet group plus physical activity. But in the Mediterranean diet only group, we also saw a significant improvement in cognition relative to the control group. This global cognition score includes 3 elements. It includes executive function, it includes memory, and it includes processing speed. We didn't see any effect on processing speed, but we did indeed see a nice effect on executive function, with, as I say, the combined Mediterranean plus physical activity group showing the greatest effect. And this was particularly evident when we assessed people used what's called the Hailing test. And also, which we were even more pleased with, we saw a very nice effect indeed of our intervention on memory. So the top line here gives our overall memory score, and then listed in this table gives the various memory tests which people undertook. And you can see that particularly for verbal paired intermediate and also our Ray auditory verbal learning test, we saw a significant effect of intervention with benefits of both groups, but particular benefit observed with the combined Mediterranean diet plus physical activity group. Now, how are the benefits of a Mediterranean diet on cognition being manifested? I mean, this is probably more of sort of academic interest rather than of general interest, but there's now strong evidence that a Mediterranean diet can affect all of these kinds of processes which contribute to brain health. Things like the health of our neurons, our ability of neurons to interact with each other through neuron transmission, the deposition of beta amyloid, glucose utilization in the brain, the functionality of the gut, neuroinflammation, and vascular health is something we're particularly interested in knowledge that the Mediterranean diet is very likely to have a positive effect on vascular health all over the body, but particularly we're interested in blood flow to the brain. And I'll actually skip through these next few slides in the interest of time. Now, just to talk about, when we talk about fruits and vegetables being beneficial for brain health, this evidence is being refined all the time, and a refinement of a traditional Mediterranean diet is a MIND diet. And in this particular MIND diet, which is kind of a combination of two different diets, what they suggest is that green leafy vegetables are particularly beneficial for brain health. So things like chard, spinach, Savoy cabbage, rocket, lettuces in general. So all of these green leafy vegetables are a particularly good source of antioxidants, and they're also a particularly good source of B vitamins, which have been shown to be really have really important neurophysiological functions. Also, berry fruit, anthocyanin-rich foods are emerging as being particularly important. So anthocyanins are a group of what we call flavonoids, and they give fruits and vegetables their typical red, purple, or sort of bluish tinges. So you'll find them in berry fruit, but also they're found in high amounts in things like red cabbage, red peppers, and red onions. And there's a lot of relatively consistent evidence to show that anthocyanin-rich foods particularly affect processing speed and also have very positive effects on cerebral blood flow. Now, I'd just like to spend a few minutes talking about whole grains and brain health. So if we come back again to this MIND diet, which is an adaptation of a Mediterranean diet, again, the MIND diet really promotes whole grains, and there's kind of quite a lot of confusion around about what a whole grain is. So just to come back to my grain, so a whole grain refers to the grain which is in its intact form. And if you take a grain, things like wheat or oats or rice or quinoa or barley, in its intact form, it consists of three different components. It consists of the starchy bit in the middle, which is broken down to glucose, called the endosperm, the fiber-rich bran, and also the nutrient-rich germ. Now, whole grains are the best way to eat grains. So whole grain wheat, quinoa, brown rice, etc. The grain can be milled to various degrees. So you can get partially milled, finely milled, or refined grains. Now, partially milled are things like oatmeal or shredded wheat, where the grain is just slightly crushed, but it's more or less intact, and it has all its bran and it's all its fiber. And the glucose and the carbohydrate is broken down and absorbed in a really gradual fashion. When we get to more finely milled grains, all of the components of the grains are still there, but it's really finely broken up. In that instance, the glucose is much more rapidly absorbed from the grain, which has deleterious metabolic consequences. But all the fiber is still present in the grain. And forms of whole grains consumed in this form are things like wholemeal bread and most breakfast cereals. Still contain the whole grain, but very much sort of broken down into small constituent parts. When we get to fully refined grains, the beneficial components have been removed. So things like the germ and the bran have been removed, and you're just left with the starchy endosperm. And that form of grain is what's used in things like white pasta manufacture, white bread manufacture, white rice. So this is the worst form really to eat your grains in. And always I would advise more consuming your grains in more the whole grain form rather than the refined form. And the reason why whole grains are really important in your diet is that they're a really important source of fiber. And here on this slide just gives examples of fiber-rich foods which you can consume in order to optimize the fiber intake of your diet. And as we'll come on to in a second, fiber is incredibly important for gut health. So I'll just give a second for you to kind of have a quick read of what fibre-rich foods are. When it comes to breakfast cereals, I would suggest things like porridge, muesli, bran flakes, all bran, fruit and fibre, Weetabix, etc. as kind of rich fibre sources. Now, as I say, the most commonly consumed form of grains in the UK diet are breakfast cereals and breads. And how do you choose a high quality breakfast cereal or bread? Well, my suggestion to do that is when you're choosing your breakfast cereal, always look on the label for the carbohydrate and fibre content. And if the ratio of carbohydrate to fibre is less than 10, then this is generally a high quality breakfast cereal. So this is just a picture of fruit and fibre from our cupboard here at home. And you can see that the carbohydrate content is 66 and the fibre content is 11. So that gives a ratio of about 6, which is very much a good quality breakfast cereal. Whereas if you look at something like cornflakes, you can see the ratio is, let me find them, 25 is to 0.8. So that's a ratio of somewhere around 30, which is a very, very poor ratio indeed. When we're talking about breads, you should look out for breads where the ratio is 6 or less. So you can see here in this example, the carbohydrates are 36 and the fibre is 7. So that is a ratio of less than 6. So that's kind of a tip to choose good quality breads and breakfast cereals. And why is it important to get whole grains, and why is it important to get fibre into your diet? Because we now know a huge amount about how the gut is related to the brain and the gut-brain axis. And the health of the GI tract influences the health of the brain through an increasingly recognized number of mechanisms, which I've listed here. The gut itself has a huge number of neurons, which are directly associated with the brain through the enteric nervous system. The gut bacteria produce a whole range of neurotransmitters which affect brain function. There are also a whole range of hormones, inflammatory mediators, and substances like short-chain fatty acids, which we now know to directly influence brain health. So really important to keep our gut healthy. Just kind of the last major area I'll talk about is something I've been working on now for longer than I care to remember: oily fish and their importance in brain health. And it's not just a fishy tale. The evidence is pretty consistent that omega-3 fatty acids and oily fish are important for brain health. And the current recommendation is that we consume at least 1 portion of oily fish per week. I would suggest we should up that to 2 in order to optimize the benefits. Why are omega-3 important for brain health? Well, the first reason and the first indication is that when we look at different tissues in the body, things like the heart, the muscle, the liver, etc., and we look at the amount of DHA, which is an omega-3 fatty acid, they have as a component part of that tissue, it's generally less than about 5% of total fat. But here I'll divert your attention to the cerebral cortex, which is the main component part of the brain. And as you can see, DHA or omega-3 fatty acids make up almost 15% of the total fat in the brain. And actually in the synaptic regions, it can make up as much as 40% of total fatty acids, which is really indicative of its importance in brain function. And there's been a whole host of studies done in a whole host of experimental models to suggest what DHA does in the brain. And I won't go through this in the interest of time, but we know a lot now about what DHA does in the brain and why it's important. One of the things we've been working on, and this is way overcomplicated, but one of the things, so I'll refer your attention to DHA here, which is the main omega-3 in the brain. And we've been doing a little bit of work to show that DHA produces a whole host of compounds called Mareson's resolvins and protectants And these compounds are emerging as being really important in dampening down inflammation in the brain. So that's one of the ways DHA is important for brain health. And what the epidemiological studies or the observational studies have been showing is that between 0.1 and 0.2 grams of DHA per day is associated with certainly improved cognition, a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease, higher total and hippocampal volumes, and improved performance on a whole host of cognitive tests. Interestingly, the evidence are even greater in females than they are in males. And our work is beginning to unravel a little bit about why this might be the case. What our recent work has shown is that as women transition through the menopause, and especially if they have a particular genotype called ApoE4, the aging process really results in a depletion in DHA in the brain. So we think that especially for women, it's really important to have adequate intakes of DHA in your diet in order to kind of counteract the effects of aging on brain DHA status. Now, interestingly, even though the observational evidence is really supportive, the clinical trial evidence is really mixed at the moment. And I was part of a working group from the Alzheimer's Association, which published a paper this year, which kind of delved into the evidence as to why often there's a lot of supportive evidence from observational studies, but the evidence from clinical trials is a little bit more mixed. And in the area of omega-3 fish oils and cognitive health, we came to the conclusion that often the studies are way too short, that actually when we're doing our clinical trials, we need to make sure that they're long enough to pick up the effects that are the benefits you're having in cognition. So that is one of the reasons we think why the clinical trials are a little bit mixed, because some of them are too short. Some of the studies that have been done so far that are too short. It takes almost 2 years to actually fully achieve the optimal level of DHA when you supplement. I mean, you'll see the benefits earlier than that, but it takes 2 years to actually for the results to plateau, or for the DHA levels to plateau. So I think I'll kind of leave it at that with some closing remarks. And just to say, even though dementia cases are rising globally, age standardized rates, which is very encouraging, are stable or are actually declining. Lifestyle behaviors have a large impact on brain health, equivalent to several years of chronological age, up to a decade of chronological age, I would suggest. A Mediterranean plant-based diet or a MIND diet, which is rich in whole grains, fruits and vegetables, in particular berry fruits and green leafy vegetables, is shown to be particularly beneficial. Omega-3 and omega-3 fatty acids derived from oily fish are emerging also as being important for brain health, although confirmation in randomized controlled trials is needed. And I would really suggest an adequate consumption of whole grains and fiber-rich foods, which is associated with optimizing gut health, which will have very much a knock-on effect on your brain health. And I will just finish off by thanking my collaborators of the work I presented to you today, and also the funders of the work I presented to you today. And I'm more than happy to take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for this really comprehensive overview, Marie. I think there was a little bit for everyone, hopefully, in there. We went all the way from the biology to recommendations for diet. It's fantastic. So if you have any questions, please put them into the chat. Or as I said, if you come on with your video, you can ask your question in person. Maybe I kick us off and just wondering, you know, a lot of course Mediterranean diets have use pasta or use rice. Do you think is this just very limited amounts they use then or is this whole grain varieties they use more?
Yeah, traditionally it's the whole grain variety. I think it's in the West, when we tend to use pasta, we tend to very much focus on the white variety, and I would recommend that we all use use the brown varieties wherever possible, because they're the white variety is basically just a source of starch and sugar, and there's very little benefits of white pasta, whereas the whole grain varieties, the brown varieties, are really a substantial source of fiber.
Great. Okay, so I didn't know that the tradition was whole grain. So that's an interesting fact. Right, we have some questions. Annelies Metz is asking, I heard that a small amount of good quality dark chocolate is also good for you. Do you want to comment on that, Anne Marie?
Yeah, absolutely. Good quality dark chocolate. Yeah, it's rich in a particular compound called flavontriols, which have been, the benefits with respect to brain health are being increasingly recognized as the research are being produced. So certainly, yeah, that is absolutely the case. What is difficult though, the bioactive component is thought to be flavontriols. And of course, most of the chocolate, when you look at the packaging, doesn't tell you how much flavontriols are in there. But certainly you've got to assume that a good quality dark chocolate will contain some of the flavontriols, which will have cognitive benefits in the long term.
And if I remember correctly, milk chocolate in general is just bad, basically, for us.
It's kind of just a source of sugar. And we have plenty of that. I mean, at the moment the recommendation is we have less than 5% of sugars in our diet, and currently the average in the UK diet is 12%. So we have plenty of sugar. We don't need chocolate to provide us with sugar.
Great. So Chris asks, where do we stand with rest omegas like 6 and 9?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. When I started off, when I was a young researcher, there was a huge concern about the omega-6, omega-3 ratio in our diet. And it was thought that we have way too much omega-6 and not enough omega-3. And there was big concern about the ratio. Now the research has very much changed, and the focus should not be so much on how much omega-6, but try and get as much omega-3 in your diet as possible. So the ratio has found to be less important, and actually it's the amount of omega-3 which seems to be more important than the ratio. Omega-9s we get mainly from olive oil. So, and olive oil is known to be a very sort of healthy, has a very good fatty acid profile, but it also contains a whole host of other bioactives. So, so the omega-6 is not so much of a concern as it was 20 years ago.
Great. And then Jane Evans is asking, is tinned tuna and smoked mackerel as good a source of DHA as fresh tuna and mackerel?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a really important point. Actually, most tinned fish is the same as its fresh equivalent when it comes to omega-3. So tinned sardines are just as good as fresh sardines. Tinned mackerel is just as good as fresh mackerel. Tuna is an exception, unfortunately, because tuna oil is quite valuable.
There's always one.
There's always one. So tuna oil is quite valuable. So they actually extract the tuna before they put it into the can. And you'll see that tuna is often canned in things like olive oil or just canned in water or something like that. So even though tuna as a fish canned tuna as a fish is very good, it won't contain much of the omega-3 fatty acid because it's been extracted already. So it'll have a much lower level than fresh tuna. When it comes to smoked mackerel will have exactly the same amount of omega-3 as fresh mackerel. But of course, the smoking process is not very good for gut health. So I would say when you're thinking about things like reducing your risk of GI cancers, it's good to kind of keep your smoked fish and smoked meat intake down to a relative minimum. So I would say fresh mackerel is probably a better food than smoked mackerel from that point of view.
Great. And Kelly Grant is asking, for a vegan diet, so strictly plant-based, is there much research around whether an omega-3 supplement from algae is as good as fish-based for brain health?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's thought that there's lots of other components in oily fish which will afford cognitive benefits in addition to the omega-3. So fish are also a good source of things like selenium and vitamin D, which you often won't get if you just have a pure algal supplement, even though there will be some vitamin D in there. So it's always better if you're a fish lover to have the oily fish rather than the supplement. But certainly the algal-based supplements are a very good substitute, and they will provide you with the same amount of the omegas as you will get from oily fish. The only thing you mightn't get the intakes of things like selenium in the supplement that you would get in the fish itself.
Great. And the next two questions, I think, are from JW142 and Hannah, which is very similar questions. So are there basically good alternatives for oily fish, or how about omega-3 supplements?
Yeah. I mean, again, we are able to some degree to make, so the beneficial omega-3s are EPA and DHA, and they're longer chain fatty acids. There's a shorter chain fatty acid called alpha-linolenic acid, which is found in lots of vegetable oils, particularly rapeseed oil is a really good source. And also things like soybean oil and walnuts are quite good sources of the shorter chain omega-3. We can to some degree synthesize the longer chain beneficial ones from the shorter chain ones, but the biosynthetic process is not very efficient. So, you know, that is a way if you're vegan or vegetarian to increase your EPA and DHA status by consuming things like nuts and consuming things like rapeseed oil and soybean oil, and the body will be able to synthesize EPA and DHA to some extent.
Great. And how about the supplements then, or taking it as a supplement? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I would say as a supplement, if you're not an oily fish lover and you prefer to take a supplement, then it is a good alternative. There's really interesting research from a colleague from Munich called Clemens von Schecke. He's a cardiologist, and he's done some really nice research which show that the availability of omega-3 from supplements is much higher if you take them with a meal rather than taking them with water or taking them with tea or coffee. And what he's shown is that if you take them with other sources of fat, that you absorb them much better. So I would suggest don't just take your supplements by themselves, take them with a meal, and then you'll be likely to have greater benefits.
Oh, really interesting. I didn't know that. So there you go.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why we think that some of the randomized controlled trials with omega-3 supplements haven't worked, because people will always take them without a meal, and then the bioavailability is likely to be much lower, which I think is really problematic.
Fascinating. Elaine asked, did you include people with existing depression in your research?
Yeah, we didn't exclude people, but I don't think using our health questionnaires that we had too many people with existing depression. But there is research being conducted as we speak on the benefits of things like omega-3 and a Mediterranean diet on depressive symptoms. And I know the PREDIMED study, which I presented, they also had one of their papers which looked at the effects of a Mediterranean diet on depressive symptoms outcomes, and the results were very positive indeed. So even though today I talk mainly about cognition, the evidence for some of these interventions for other brain health outcomes, things like mood and anxiety, are also very promising, I have to say.
Yeah, really interesting question. Then Julie West is asking, thank you, Anne Marie. Is there any evidence on the impact of the cooking process used for each food type? So, for example, is there much nutritional difference between fresh spinach, cooked spinach, or is it just great to eat lots of spinach?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question as well. I mean, there's kind of a myth that, you know, you have to eat everything fresh, raw, and whole to get the benefits. But actually, frozen vegetables are perfectly good. Canned vegetables are perfectly good. Once you cook them, the only nutrient that you lose in significant amounts if you boil your vegetables to death, for example, is vitamin C, because vitamin C is water soluble, so you tend to lose it into your cooking water when you strain it off. But most of the other things like fiber and the flavonoids and the B vitamins, you will have almost the same amount in your cooked version as you will in your raw version, with the notable exception of vitamin C. It's always better to eat things fresh when it comes to vitamin C, because it's very labile, and really you lose a lot of it into the cooking water, and then mostly we dispose of that cooking water.
Great. And Kelly Grant asked another question. Does the research include benefits or negative effects of coffee and tea on gut health?
Yes, we haven't done so much on that, I have to say. I mean, again, coffee and tea are good sources of dietary flavonoids, and mainly these compounds escape digestion in the upper gut and mainly reach the gut bacteria in the lower gut. So from the point of view of being a very significant source of dietary flavonoids in the UK diet, one would assume, even though I'm not so familiar with the research, that tea and coffee would have a positive impact on both the profile of our gut bacteria and also on its metabolic profile.
Great. Excellent. Jane, yes, please ask your question in person.
Yes, I thought I'd ask this in person, actually, and thank you very much. That's really interesting. I work at the Forum in Norwich, so just down the road from your offices, and I'm part of the team that organises the Norwich Science Festival. And I wondered if outside of this meeting we could approach you to perhaps talk about including a talk along this subject in our Science Festival next February.
Yeah, I'm sure that could be arranged, Jane. Just drop me an email.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And I think Nick has a question. Nick, do you want to come on? Maybe Nick, I'm not sure you can hear me. I think you have a raised hand. If you don't want to ask a question, just remove the hand. Oh, there he is. Oh, I can't hear you, Nick. Let's see. No, I can't hear you. Anne Marie, can you hear Nick?
No, I can't. I can see you were just connecting to audio, Nick, but it hasn't come through.
Maybe type your question, Nick, if you can. Sorry. I think Kelly has another question. With the recommendation in the MIND diet to eat little meat, is this due to the negative effects on gut health? I think this is red meat mostly, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's red meat. It's a good question, actually. I mean, it's particularly processed meat isn't recommended. I mean, red meat is suggested to be reduced as well, but particularly of the processed meat variety. So we're really encouraged to kind of limit our intake of things like sausages and burgers and really poor quality red meat. And I think also the reason why red meat is disencouraged, it is because of the effect on the gut microbiome, but it's also to encourage the alternatives, which is to encourage things like meat consumption and to encourage things like plant sources of protein rather than using meat as our source of protein. And also there's concern about I think too much iron being provided from red meat and the consequences of that. So I think it's a bit, the basis for red meat is a bit of a mixed bag, really. I don't think it's just due to one reason. It's kind of a combined basis for that particular recommendation.
Great, I think. So Jill, okay, no, there are lots of comments already that people need to leave, and very complimentary on your presentation. I'm not sure if Nick's question is still coming through, but just before everybody leaves, just want to share. So our next speaker, just to make that, is on the 24th of November, and it's Tim Ridman from Cambridge, and he talks about more the less common forms of dementia. And so Tim, if you have a most people who have Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia are seen locally, but if you have a less common form of dementia, usually you're sent down to Adam Brooks for the specialist clinics, and you will likely see Tim or one of his colleagues. So he will talk a little bit about that and what they do and what types of less common forms there are of dementia. And so again, if you're on our email list, you will be informed anyway of this. And but if not, get in touch. As I said, it's 24th of November at 2 o'clock again on Zoom. And maybe, well, yeah, there's Dan put down the link on our page, and Dan, maybe you can put our email address as well again for people. And just to say again, thank you so much, Anne Marie, for talking today. It was really interesting. I learned a lot as well. So it's good. I'm not sure I'm giving up on the butter, though. I have to say that's a hard one for me.
Yeah, I have the same difficulty actually.
And well, thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully see you at one of our next meetings. Thank you and bye.